I will start now. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know whether you can remember what your favourite book was when you were little, or maybe your favourite film. Well, I would like to talk to you about my favourite book. It was a book that I got for Christmas when I was 8. And my favourite book is called When Hitler Stole Pink Rabbit. It's an absolute timeless classic. It's really appropriate for children of all ages and adults as well. So I'd like to start by giving you a brief summary of the plot, and then I'd like to explain why I've chosen to talk about it and what I think the broader significance of this book is, and the pertinence of it for today. So the book tells the story of Anna, who's a little German girl. She's living in Berlin in 1933. She has an older brother, Max, and she lives with her mum and her dad. Her dad is a famous author. And the book opens with her walking back from school with her friend Elsbeth. And on the way back from school, they're talking about buying a yo-yo. And all of a sudden, they see a poster. They see a poster in the street, and it's a poster for Adolf Hitler. The book is set in 1933, just before the 1933 German elections. Hitler was a candidate at the time. Anna does not know who Hitler is, but she thinks he looks rather like Charlie Chaplin. So she doesn't know anything about what's going on, but she's a normal child. She likes drawing, painting, playing board games. She fights with her older brother. She likes apple strudel, very normal, regular things. Just before the elections, she sees the Reichstag on fire. The Reichstag, the German parliament, is burning. And she also realizes that her father is nowhere to be found. Her mother then explains to her that her father had to get out of the country before his passport was taken away. The reason was that they feared that the Nazis were going to win the elections and take over. And since her father was a prominent writer and a prominent critic of the Nazis, they thought it was best to leave the country. In addition to this, the family is Jewish, so they think that the best decision is to leave the country. So Hitler wins the elections. The mother starts packing all of their things. They are told that they're leaving to go on a long holiday. It's presented as a rather exciting adventure. They are told that they have to go and join their father in Switzerland. So they go to Zurich, where it is hoped that the father will be able to write for a Swiss newspaper without fearing any censoring. The title of the book comes from the fact that Anna has to choose between a little woolly dog and a pink rabbit when she's packing her suitcase, because there isn't room for both of them. Her pink rabbit was her favourite toy when she was little, but she forgoes this pink rabbit for a woolly dog, and then she regrets it afterwards. The pink rabbit is a kind of motif throughout the book. It's an emblem of loss, and it shows this small child's sense of responsibility for events which are far beyond her control. So it is rather a significant symbol. She regrets leaving the pink rabbit behind, and she has all these images of Hitler stealing her pink rabbit and playing with it behind her back. When she goes to Switzerland, she has to adjust to her new home, to the new culture, to a new school. After that, the family decides to move to France, to Paris, because the father can't get work in Switzerland. And at the end of the book, they move to England and they take refuge in England. So she goes from being a 9-year-old girl whose only problem in life is negotiating the consequences of having a famous writer for a father, to an anxious refugee experiencing nightmares and left without anything at all. I liked this book when I was younger because it was exciting. The main character visits different countries, experiences different cultures, which I thought was really exotic and exciting when I was younger, and still do. Her own loving home reminded me of my own loving home. I could identify with Anna because I too have a very annoying brother. And there were certain passages in it which I think are really heartwarming, and that I can identify with as a learner and a student of French. For example, when Anna is in Paris, she really struggles to learn French. She's going to a French school, but she's struggling. And she feels like she is trying so hard, but getting nowhere, and she feels low and down about herself. And her mother takes her out for a delicious pastry to cheer her up and lovingly boost her self-esteem. It's a really heartwarming passage, and it's a passage that I sometimes still turn to when battling with anxiety over my own French B, or attempts to have a French B. Now, it seems on the face of it to be a simple story about a refugee. It seems to be a story seen through the eyes of a young girl. And on the face of it, it seems like that is all it is. But actually, Anna is the author, Judith Kerr's alter ego, because the book is actually an autobiography. It is a story of the author, Judith Kerr herself, who was a child who grew up in Germany. And at the age of 9, she had to flee because her family was Jewish and her father was a prominent critic of Nazism. So they had to flee, and they went to Switzerland, then to France, then to England. What I later came to realize about the book is that it's multidimensional. There are many different layers to it, and that's why I've chosen to talk about it today. Anna goes on several journeys. The first journey is a literal one. She passes through temporary lodgings. She has to make new friends, adapt to strange languages and cultures. And all of this is described with a kind of stoical humor. For example, when she's in Switzerland, she's taught to yodel, and boys at one point start pelting her with pebbles because apparently it is a custom in Switzerland that when somebody is in love with you or has a crush on you, they will just throw pebbles at you. So she sees Max, her brother, throwing unripe apples at a girl, and she says with a lot of humour, Max is very adaptable. So there's quite a lot of humour in the book as well. In Paris, her mum buys her this pastry, and then they can't afford fish for supper, but Anna thinks that's okay because they can have mussels instead, and that'll be an exotic treat. So the book is really heartwarming, and there's a lot of cheerfulness that comes through, despite the fact that the backdrop of the book is rather somber and dark. When Anna and Max are in England, they have fun trying to pronounce the English names of the train stations, for example. But underneath this comedic tone, there is a darker journey. The family is basically teetering on the edge of destitution and poverty because they've had to leave everything behind them in Berlin. They're dependent on the kindness of strangers, but they feel like self-pity is impossible because the darkest story of all is that of their friends back in Germany who thought it was ridiculous to leave the country before the elections. There are definitely dark moments in the book. Anna overhears conversations between her parents, and there are these little glimpses of the horror of the situation. For example, she overhears her mother talking about inhumane treatment suffered by a Jewish professor back in Germany. Anna then overhears her mother saying that there is a price on her father's head, a price of several thousand Reichsmarks. Obviously, what this means is that the Nazis will pay anyone to capture her father and bring him back to Germany because he was a well-known dissident. But then she thinks that it's literal. She thinks that her father will literally be put in a room and have thousands of coins poured on his head. So we can see these glimpses of the horror of the situation through the eyes of an innocent child who is desperately trying to make sense of the confusing world that she's living in. Her parents are trying to shield her from this in their love and kindness, but you still have these dark glimpses. And these dark glimpses are actually juxtaposed with scenes which are indicative of normal family life. She has arguments with her brother. Her mother burns potatoes and is generally quite bad when it comes to domestic tasks. They buy Christmas presents for each other. But the book is stimulating exactly for this reason, because it is so multidimensional. It has multiple layers. And I think that is what makes it timeless and appealing to people of all ages. There are passages where we can deeply empathize with Anna and with her family. For example, we identify with her difficulties in adapting to new environments and new cultures. In addition to that, there is the humour, which is charming, but at the same time, which causes you to reflect. And then, of course, you have the underlying darkness perceived through the lens of a child. If you're reading it as an adult, what's interesting is you already know what happened in Nazi Germany. You already know about the horrific persecution of the Jews. So you have this dual perspective. On the one hand, you have your own perspective, which is informed by hindsight and the knowledge of history. And then on the other hand, you have the perspective of the child who is struggling to make sense of this confusing world. And there is this playoff, I think, between the two perspectives, your adult perspective and the child's perspective. This is why I think the book is quite deep, actually. Anna sees the world in a simple way, but yet in a very enlightened way. She has a very simple interpretation of what's going on, but I think it is actually something that we can all learn from. It's something that actually can help to challenge moral relativism. For example, she doesn't understand why Jews are so hated by the Nazis. She's a Jew, and she doesn't see herself or her family in the way that they are depicted in Nazi propaganda. Nazi propaganda says that Jews are evil, but her mother and father have always treated her with love and treated everyone else with respect. So that can't be true. There are so many lies which she's trying to deconstruct, and the way in which she does this, I think, is very heartwarming and also enlightening. In addition to that, I think the book can help us see the plight of child refugees, both then and now. It can also show us how the simple logic of a child can often be the best tool for breaking down artificial and arbitrary prejudices. Anna herself doesn't know what the word refugee means. She's told that she is one, but she doesn't know what it means. And in the book, she tries to find out what her real identity is, what it means to be a refugee. I think that the book can be a good way of teaching children about the Second World War and the persecution of Jews and the plight of refugees. It's a gentle book. There's no graphic details, but there are glimpses, and glimpses which cause us to reflect, both adults and children. I think it is refreshing because it also puts the power of the narrative in the hands of a child, somebody who we don't often give a voice to. And we often have a tendency to think that children aren't quite adults. They're not quite fully fledged human beings, so we don't need to give them a voice. That their perspective doesn't count. But this narrative is striking because it sticks two fingers up at that idea. And it shows that children do count, that their experiences are extremely, extremely valuable. In conclusion, last night I was actually listening to a Spanish podcast, which incidentally I would highly recommend to any Hispanists here. The podcast is called Cinco Continentes, and it's a geopolitical podcast. It deals with many topics related to international politics. And on this Spanish podcast, obviously interpreted into Spanish, I heard Priti Patel, a member of the government of my own country, saying that she was going to end freedom of movement, and that Britain would only accept certain immigrants. Britain would only accept the immigrants that, I quote, we like. And it made me think that who are we to judge who should come into our country or not? We seem to think in our utmost wisdom and divine insight that we can choose who's intelligent enough and worthy enough to come into our country and to cross boundaries which, in my view, are completely arbitrary. Frontiers are not God-made, they are man-made, they are arbitrary. And for some reason, countries and people like Priti Patel think that they have the divine right to choose who crosses these arbitrary borders. And in this climate where often dominant political discourses are anti-refugee and anti-immigrant, where immigrants are treated as numbers and figures, I think people in domains such as art and culture are doing an excellent job, because they are slowly trying to change things. They are trying to encourage children to think about the plight of refugees. They are trying to humanize them, get us to think of refugees as precisely what they are, fellow human beings in search of a better life with hopes and dreams, just like the rest of us. There are many examples of this. I could talk about the Paddington Bear films, where the director was clearly trying to show through the history and the story of a bear in a hostile environment, the refugees might look different or they might seem different, but actually they are just as worthy of love and care and protection as anybody else. So to Priti Patel and her ilk, my message to them would be, just remember the story of little Anna. Thank you.